My life wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I'd worked hard to build a life I was proud of, carving out a comfortable, if simple, existence. David and I had been married for 3 years, and while every marriage has its ups and downs, I thought we had a good thing going. He was kind, thoughtful, and supportive. Our relationship had started out as a whirlwind romance, lots of passion and shared dreams. But somewhere along the way, outside forces began creeping in. From the beginning, I knew David's mother, Barbara, was going to be a challenge. She wasn't overtly hostile. No, her specialty was the passive-aggressive remark. "Oh, that's an interesting way to cook chicken," she'd say, inspecting my roast with a raised eyebrow. Or, "I guess some women don't want to iron shirts anymore," when David showed up in a slightly wrinkled button-up. She had a knack for making you feel small while smiling sweetly and pretending she was just being helpful. At first, I brushed it off. She was my mother-in-law, after all, and I figured that her comments came from a place of love, or at least concern for her son. But as time went on, I realized there was more to it. Barbara didn't see me as her son's wife. She saw me as an obstacle. Her obsession with David's ex, Stephanie, started innocuously enough. "Stephanie was so talented," she'd muse during family dinners, as if I hadn't been sitting right there. "She had a real eye for decor. You should have seen the way she decorated David's first apartment." I'd smile politely, clenching my teeth, while David stared at his plate, pretending not to notice. Stephanie, it seemed, was Barbara's ideal match for her son. Never mind that she and David had broken up years ago, long before I came into the picture. David always downplayed it. "That's just how she is," he'd say. "She's nostalgic." Nostalgic? Barbara had a framed picture of Stephanie and David from their college days sitting on her mantle, right next to our wedding photo. When I pointed it out, he shrugged. "She probably just forgot to take it down. It's no big deal." Except it was. Barbara's subtle jabs turned into more direct interference. She'd invite Stephanie to family gatherings under the guise of maintaining friendship and make a show of seating her near David. "Oh, you two have so much history," she'd say. "It's a shame things didn't work out." Meanwhile, Stephanie, ever eager to ingratiate herself, played right along, laughing at Barbara's jokes and slipping into old, familiar conversations with David. It made my blood boil, but I bit my tongue, unwilling to cause a scene. The turning point came at Christmas last year. Barbara had invited everyone to her house, and as always, Stephanie was there. During the gift exchange, Barbara handed Stephanie a beautifully wrapped box. Inside was a piece of jewelry, a delicate gold bracelet engraved with the words, "For someone who will always be family." Stephanie gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Barbara, this is so thoughtful," she gushed, while I sat there feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. I confronted David that night. "This isn't normal," I said, pacing our bedroom while he sat on the bed, rubbing his temples. "She's openly undermining our marriage, and you're letting her." "She doesn't mean it like that," he said, exasperated. "You're reading too much into it." "Am I? Because it feels like your mother is setting the stage for Stephanie to swoop in and take my place." David didn't respond right away. Finally, he said, "I'll talk to her." But he never did. At least, not in a way that made a difference. Barbara's meddling continued, and over time, I began to feel like a guest in my own marriage. Every family event felt like a battle, every conversation with her a minefield. Still, I held on to the hope that David and I could rise above it, that eventually Barbara would accept that I was here to stay. I didn't know then just how far she'd go to get her way, or how much I'd have to fight to keep the life I'd built. It started with a text message. I was at work, finishing up some reports, when my phone buzzed. It was from Barbara. The message read, "Family reunion this Saturday. Everyone's coming. Hope you and David can make it. Stephanie will be there too. Should be fun." My stomach churned at the mention of Stephanie. Why did Barbara always have to include her? This was supposed to be a family reunion, not an ex-girlfriend appreciation event. I debated showing the text to David but decided against it. He'd only brush it off, like always. Saturday came faster than I wanted, and Barbara's house was already buzzing with activity by the time we arrived. The yard was decorated with string lights and flowers, and tables were set with crisp white tablecloths. It looked more like a wedding than a casual family gathering. I mentioned this to David as we walked in, but he shrugged, saying Barbara liked to go all out. Stephanie was, of course, already there. She was dressed in a pale pink dress, looking every bit like she'd stepped out of a bridal magazine. She smiled brightly when she saw David, walking up to give him a hug that lingered a little too long. "David, it's so good to see you," she gushed, ignoring me entirely. I swallowed my irritation and tried to enjoy the evening, but something felt off. Barbara was unusually chipper, flitting between guests with a self-satisfied smile. Several people gave me odd looks, as if they knew something I didn't. It wasn't until I overheard Barbara whispering to a group of relatives that the pieces started to fall into place. "I'm so glad everyone could be here for this special day," she said, her voice low but giddy. "David and Stephanie were always meant to be. Tonight is about making things right." My blood ran cold. Special day? Making things right? I needed to know what was going on. I slipped away from the crowd and found Barbara in the kitchen, adjusting a tray of hors d'oeuvres. "What's this all about?" I asked, keeping my voice calm despite the storm brewing inside me. She turned, feigning surprise. "It's just a reunion, dear. Don't read too much into it." "Cut the act," I said, stepping closer. "I heard you talking. What's really going on?" Barbara's smile faltered for a split second before she regained her composure. "It's nothing you need to worry about," she said airily. "Why don't you go enjoy the party?" I didn't get a chance to press her further because someone called her away, but I wasn't about to let it go. I grabbed David, pulling him aside. "Do you know what's happening here?" I asked, my voice low but urgent. He frowned. "What do you mean?" "I think your mom is planning something involving Stephanie." David sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "You're overthinking this. It's just a party." Before I could respond, Barbara's voice rang out from the backyard. "Everyone, please gather around. We have a little surprise for you." We joined the crowd, and my heart sank as I saw Stephanie standing at the center, looking radiant and smug. Barbara gestured toward her with a flourish. "Tonight, we're celebrating the reunion of two people who were always destined to be together." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Stephanie beamed. I felt like I was in a nightmare. Barbara turned to David. "Come on, darling. Stand with Stephanie. Let's make this official." David looked stunned, glancing at me and then at his mother. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Before she could answer, I stepped forward, my voice cutting through the chaos. "I'd like to know that too." Barbara's smile finally cracked, and I could see the panic in her eyes. "This isn't what it looks like," she stammered. "Oh, I think it's exactly what it looks like," I said, my anger finally spilling over. "And I'm not going to let you get away with it." The backyard was silent for a moment after my outburst, save for the chirping of crickets. The festive atmosphere had evaporated, leaving a tension so thick it felt suffocating. All eyes were on me, and for once, Barbara didn't have a quick quip or smug retort. "What's going on, Mom?" David asked, his voice sharp with confusion and anger. Barbara plastered on a shaky smile, her eyes darting between David and me. "It's just a little fun," she said, trying to sound innocent. "A symbolic reunion. Everyone knows how close you and Stephanie used to be." "A symbolic reunion?" I snapped, stepping forward. "You called all these people here for what? To stage some bizarre mock wedding between your son and his ex?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd, the guests exchanging uneasy glances. Stephanie, still standing in the middle of the spectacle, looked mortified. Her confidence had wavered, but she managed to speak. "This isn't a wedding," she said, her tone defensive. "Barbara just thought it would be nice to, celebrate our friendship." "Friendship?" I repeated, incredulous. "You're wearing a dress that screams bride, And there's a literal archway decorated with flowers behind you. David's face was a mix of confusion and dawning realization. Mom? He said slowly, his voice low and dangerous. You need to explain yourself. Now. Barbara folded her arms, regaining a hint of her usual defiance. Fine. You want the truth? The truth is that Stephanie is better for you. She always has been. This marriage of yours is a mistake, David. I've tried to be supportive, but it's clear to everyone that you're not happy. And neither am I. David blinked, stunned by her audacity. Not happy? Mom? What are you even talking about? I'm perfectly happy with my wife. Barbara let out a bitter laugh. Oh, please. You've changed since you married her. You used to be so full of potential, but now, look at you. You're a shell of yourself. The words hit me like a slap. My throat tightened, but I forced myself to stand tall. David isn't a shell of himself, I said, my voice steady despite the fire in my chest. He's a grown man with his own life, and you can't stand that you're not the one controlling it anymore. Barbara's eyes narrowed. Don't you dare talk to me like that in my own house. I'll talk however I please, I shot back. You've been undermining me since day one, and I'm done playing nice. This stops now. David held up a hand, silencing us both. Enough, he said, his tone commanding. He turned to his mother. Mom, this is beyond disrespectful, not just to me, but to my wife. I trusted you, and you pull something like this? What were you thinking? Barbara's lips tightened. I was thinking about what's best for you. What's best for me? David echoed, his voice rising. Do you hear yourself? What you've done tonight is cruel, manipulative, and completely out of line. The crowd had shifted into uncomfortable silence, everyone unsure where to look. Finally, one of Barbara's sisters spoke up, her voice hesitant. Barbara, maybe this wasn't the best idea. You should apologize. Apologize? Barbara spat, her composure cracking further. I was trying to save my son from a mistake. A mistake? David's voice broke, anger and hurt spilling into his words. My marriage is not a mistake. Liz is my wife and I love her. You don't get to decide what's best for me. I felt tears prick at my eyes, but I held them back. This wasn't the time to cry. It was the time to fight. I stepped closer to David, taking his hand in mine. You've been trying to sabotage us since day one, I said to Barbara. But guess what? It didn't work. David and I are stronger than ever, and nothing you do is going to change that. Barbara looked like she wanted to argue, but the crowd had turned against her. People were whispering, shaking their heads, some even walking away in disgust. Stephanie stood awkwardly by the arch, clearly regretting her decision to play along with Barbara's scheme. I think we're done here, I said firmly, turning to leave. But before we could go, Barbara shouted, You're going to regret this, David. Mark my words. David didn't even turn around. No, Mom. The only thing I regret is trusting you. We left the party, hand in hand, with Barbara's venomous glare burning into our backs. That night, back at home, David and I sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he spoke. I'm sorry, he said, his voice heavy with guilt. I should have stood up to her sooner. It's not your fault, I said softly. She's your mother. You wanted to believe the best in her. But this was too far. He nodded, his jaw tightening. I'm done, Liz. Done with her manipulation, her schemes, all of it. From now on, our marriage is our priority. No one else gets to interfere. Hearing him say that felt like a weight lifting off my chest. We're a team, I said, squeezing his hand, and together we can handle anything. The storm with Barbara was far from over, I knew that much, but for the first time I felt like we had the strength to face it together. Barbara wasn't one to back down quietly. After the fiasco at her house, I expected her to let things simmer for a while, but she proved me wrong. The very next day, David and I were bombarded with texts and calls. Some were from Barbara, dripping with self-pity and guilt-tripping. Others were from extended family, urging us to apologize and smooth things over. David stayed firm. We're not apologizing for standing up for ourselves, he told me, deleting yet another text from his mother. Still, the constant pressure was wearing on both of us. Then came the final straw. One evening, while David was at work, I got a call from a close friend who had attended Barbara's reunion. Her voice was laced with concern. "Liz, have you seen the Facebook post?" she asked. "What post?" I asked, dread creeping into my stomach. "It's... Barbara put up a long post about you and David. She's saying some pretty nasty things." My heart sank as I hung up and immediately opened Facebook. There it was, a public post from Barbara, complete with a flattering photo of her and Stephanie taken at the event. The caption read, "Family deserves to be with the right people, not manipulated by outsiders. A mother only wants what's best for her child. Some people don't understand loyalty or love." My blood boiled as I scrolled through the comments. Family members and acquaintances were chiming in, some agreeing with her vague accusations, others expressing confusion. Barbara hadn't mentioned me by name, but it was painfully clear who she was talking about. I had had enough. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting my marriage and setting boundaries once and for all. I decided it was time to fight back, not with anger, but with the truth. When David got home, I showed him the post. His face turned red with anger as he read it. "That's it," he said, grabbing his phone. "Wait," I said, placing a hand on his arm. "Let's not stoop to her level. We'll handle this another way." The next morning, I sent Barbara a text. "We need to talk. Meet us at the coffee shop on Main at 10 a.m. No excuses." David and I arrived early, sitting in a quiet corner of the cafe. Barbara walked in exactly on time, her face a mask of indignant defiance. "I hope you're here to apologize," she said as she sat down, crossing her arms. I leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "Apologize? For what exactly? For not letting you ruin my marriage? For calling out your manipulative behavior?" Barbara scoffed. "Manipulative? I'm looking out for my son." "No," David said firmly, his voice low but steady. "You're trying to control me. There's a difference, and it ends now." Barbara started to speak, but I cut her off. "I saw your Facebook post, Barbara. That's not looking out for your son. That's trying to humiliate me and undermine our relationship. And if you think I'm going to let that slide, think again." "What I posted was the truth," she said stubbornly. "You've driven a wedge between me and David. I had no choice but to defend myself." David laughed bitterly. "Defend yourself? Mom, you organized a fake wedding for me and Stephanie. You've been disrespecting my wife since the day I introduced her to you. This has nothing to do with defending yourself and everything to do with you refusing to let go of control." Barbara's face flushed. "You're ungrateful, David, after everything I've done for you." "Everything you've done for me?" David interrupted, his voice rising. "You mean like constantly comparing Liz to Stephanie? Or trying to dictate how I live my life? Mom, I'm done. I'm done letting you interfere in my marriage, done letting you disrespect my wife, and done letting you manipulate me into feeling guilty for not living the way you want me to." I took a deep breath, feeling a surge of pride for David. "Barbara," I said, my tone calm but firm, "this is the last conversation we're having about this. If you can't respect our boundaries, then you won't be a part of our lives. It's that simple." Her jaw dropped. "You're threatening to cut me off? Over her?" "No," David said. "I'm promising to protect my wife. If you can't handle that, then yes, we're prepared to cut ties." The tension was palpable as Barbara sat there, stunned into silence. For once, she had no snide remark, no manipulative comeback. She realized, perhaps for the first time, that we were serious. "Fine," she said finally, her voice tight. "If that's how you feel, then don't expect me to come running back when this marriage falls apart." I stood, signaling that the conversation was over. "This marriage isn't falling apart, Barbara, and it never will because we're a team. Goodbye." David and I walked out of the cafe hand in hand, leaving Barbara behind. As we stepped into the sunlight, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time, I truly believed that David and I could move forward together without interference. Barbara may have been the storm, but we were the lighthouse, standing strong and unwavering. The fallout from that meeting with Barbara was swift and dramatic. True to her word, or her threat, she stopped contacting us entirely. At first, it felt strange, like the calm after a storm. There were no intrusive calls, no passive-aggressive comments, and no orchestrated disasters to handle. The silence was almost unsettling, but it didn't take long for us to settle into a new rhythm. David and I threw ourselves into rebuilding our relationship, one free from his mother's influence. We began prioritizing each other in ways we hadn't before. There were more date nights, more open conversations, and fewer distractions. For the first time in years, it felt like we were truly a team, united and unstoppable. The absence of Barbara also brought a surprising clarity. David admitted to me one night over dinner that he hadn't fully understood the depth of his mother's manipulation until that meeting. "I think I just got so used to it growing up," he said, shaking his head. "It felt normal, but now that it's gone, it's like I can finally breathe." I squeezed his hand. That's all I've ever wanted, for us to live our lives on our own terms. Still, Barbara wasn't completely out of the picture. Word of our confrontation spread quickly through the family, and opinions were divided. Some relatives applauded us for setting boundaries, while others felt we'd been too harsh. A few tried to mediate, suggesting we extend an olive branch, but David stood firm. "Mom has to meet us halfway," he told them. "We've made our terms clear. If she can respect them, we're open to talking. But we're not going back to how things were." Stephanie, to my surprise, also reached out. In a carefully worded email, she apologized for her involvement in Barbara's schemes, claiming she'd been caught off guard and hadn't realized the extent of what Barbara was planning. I read the email twice, trying to decide if I believed her sincerity. In the end, I chose to let it go. Whether her apology was genuine or an attempt to save face didn't matter anymore. She was no longer part of our lives, and that was enough. Months passed, and the peace we'd worked so hard to achieve began to feel natural. Our home became a haven, filled with laughter, quiet evenings, and plans for the future. We started talking about things we hadn't dared to before: traveling, career goals, even the possibility of starting a family someday. One afternoon, as we were sorting through old photos to make an album, David paused, holding up a picture of him and Barbara from years ago. "Do you think she'll ever change?" he asked quietly. I thought about it for a moment before answering. "I don't know, but whether she does or doesn't, it doesn't have to define us. We've made it through the worst of it, and we're stronger now. That's what matters." He nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "You're right. We've got everything we need right here." In time, Barbara did reach out, though not with the apology we'd hoped for. Her message was curt, asking if we'd consider meeting to discuss the situation. David and I talked it over and decided we weren't ready. She hadn't shown any indication of change, and we weren't willing to risk reopening old wounds without real progress. Life moved on. The weight of Barbara's control lifted entirely, replaced by the freedom to live authentically and without fear of judgment. And while the scars of her meddling lingered, they became reminders of how far we'd come and how much stronger we were together. Barbara may have tried to tear us apart, but in the end, her actions only solidified what we already knew. Love built on respect and trust can withstand even the fiercest storm. 2 years later, life looks entirely different. David and I moved into a cozy house on the edge of town, surrounded by trees and quiet. Our days are filled with plans for the future and laughter over the little things, inside jokes, shared glances, and the warmth that comes from truly being at peace. Barbara remains distant, her occasional messages carefully polite, but lacking warmth. We keep our boundaries firm, knowing it's for the best. The family has largely adjusted, no longer pressuring us to reconcile on her terms. One sunny afternoon, as David and I worked on the nursery, our first baby due in a few months, I paused to look at him. He was humming softly, assembling a crib, his face full of concentration. "Hey," I said, smiling. You're going to be an amazing dad." He looked up, his grin bright and full of love. "And you're going to be the best mom." For the first time, I felt like everything was exactly as it should be.